At 2:17 a.m., a man arrived at the emergency bay doors of Hargrove Regional Medical Center with 3 stab wounds, a collapsed lung, and a military dog tag around his neck that nobody was supposed to see. The nurses scrambled. The attending physician shouted orders he wasn't sure about, and Detective Raymond Holt, badge gleaming, jaw set, eyes scanning the room like he owned every square foot of it, walked straight past the bleeding man and pointed at one nurse, one specific nurse, and said 4 words that would unravel everything. Get her out, now. If this story already has you hooked, hit that follow button, give it a like, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. Now let's get into it. The hospital sat on the eastern edge of Calverton, Texas, in the kind of neighborhood where the streetlights were always half functioning and the ambulances arrived more often than the mail. Hargrove Regional wasn't the most prestigious medical center in the state. It wasn't even the cleanest. But it was the only level 2 trauma facility within 40 miles, and that fact alone kept it running, kept its nurses overworked, kept its doctors stretched thin, and kept people like Nora Slade showing up at 6:45 a.m. for a shift that was supposed to start at 7. Nora was 28 years old. She had dark circles under her eyes that no amount of sleep seemed to touch, short nails she'd long since stopped trying to grow out, and a way of moving through a crowded emergency department that other nurses noticed and couldn't quite explain. Deliberate, unhurried, like she'd already mapped every obstacle in the room before she walked into it. She wasn't loud. She didn't gossip in the break room or fight over shifts or complain when the charge nurse handed her the worst patients on the floor. She just worked. Most of her colleagues liked her well enough. A few of them found her unsettling without being able to say why. The morning started the way most mornings did, with a backlog. Bed 4 needs a new IV line, said Terry Gaines, the charge nurse, without looking up from her clipboard. Terry was 53, had been at Hargrove for 22 years, and had developed the specific kind of exhaustion that wasn't about sleep. And Bed 9's catheter pulled again. Blankenship's already on the warpath about the overnight charting, so for the love of everything, make sure your notes are complete before 9. Got it, Nora said. You're also covering Priya's patients while she's in the procedure suite. That's 6 total. 7. Bed 2 came in at 4 a.m., possible sepsis. He's been on fluids, but nobody's checked in an hour. Nora took the clipboard, scanned the names, and went to work. The sepsis patient, a man named Gerald Whitmore, 61, retired electrician, was pale and clammy in a way that Nora didn't like. His blood pressure had drifted since the last reading. She adjusted his fluids, flagged the attending physician, Dr. Vincent Calder, and stood in the doorway of his office long enough to make sure he actually looked up from his phone. Whitmore in bed 2, she said. His MAP is dropping. He needs a repeat lactate, and I'd want to start pressors if we're not already thinking about it. Calder was 47, silver-haired, and had the kind of confidence that came from years of being the smartest person in whatever room he chose to walk into. He looked at Nora the way he looked at most of the nursing staff, like they were delivering a message he'd already heard. I'll get to him, he said. His last lactate was 4.2. A pause. I said I'll get to him, Slade. She held his gaze for exactly 2 seconds, then turned and walked back to the floor. She ordered the repeat lactate herself, flagged it for the attending, and documented every step. Then she moved to bed 4. This was the rhythm of Nora Slade's life at Hargrove Regional. She pushed. She was ignored. She pushed again through paperwork and protocol, through proper channels and documented orders, until the right thing happened whether anyone wanted it to or not. It wasn't heroic. It wasn't glamorous. It was just the way she knew how to function. What she didn't talk about, what she never talked about, was why she knew how to function that way. Before Hargrove, before nursing school, before Calverton, there had been something else. Something she'd put down like a weapon she no longer needed. 4 years with the Army as a combat medic. 2 deployments, 14 months in environments where the phrase, I'll get to him, could mean a body bag. She'd treated gunshot wounds with improvised pressure dressings in the back of vehicles that were still moving. She'd kept a man's organs inside his body with her bare hands for 11 minutes until a surgical team arrived. She had done things that didn't fit inside a civilian hospital resume, and she had made the deliberate choice not to put them there. She was done with that life. She thought. By noon, the floor had settled into its usual controlled chaos. Nora was charting at the nurse's station when Detective Raymond Holt walked in for the third time that week. He wasn't there for a patient. He was never there for a patient. Holt was a Calverton PD detective, mid-40s, built like someone who used to be athletic, and had since traded the discipline for authority. He had a habit of showing up at Hargrove unannounced, moving through the emergency department like it was an extension of his precinct, speaking to the nursing staff in a tone that hovered just below openly insulting. Nobody had filed a formal complaint. Nobody wanted to. Holt had been with the department for 18 years and had a reputation for making the professional lives of people who crossed him significantly more difficult. Slade. He said her name the way some people say a word they don't particularly like the sound of. He stopped at the nurse's station, rested both hands on the counter, and leaned in slightly. I need the chart on the Walker patient. Room 6. Patient charts aren't released to law enforcement without proper authorization, Nora said. You know that. I'm not asking for a legal seminar, I'm asking for the chart. And I'm telling you the process. You need a warrant or documented patient consent. I can get you the forms. Holt looked at her for a moment. Not the impatient look he gave the other nurses. Something slower, more deliberate. Like he was making a note. You've got a lot of opinions for someone in your position, he said. My position is patient advocate, Nora said. So yeah. He pushed off the counter and left. Terry appeared at Nora's shoulder approximately 4 seconds later. You know he's going to make a call about that, Terry said, her voice low. Let him make the call. He doesn't have the right to the chart, and you know it. Terry pressed her lips together. I know that. But knowing that and having Raymond Holt decide you're a problem are two very different things around here. Nora already knew that. She went back to charting. It was 2:17 a.m. when the ambulance pulled into the bay. Nora was covering a double, so not unusual, not ideal, the product of 2 call-outs and a staffing shortage that administration had been actively addressing for 4 months. She heard the radio crackle before the doors opened, heard the paramedic's voice tight and clipped in the way that meant it was bad. Male, approximately 35 3-penetrating wounds, 2 to the torso, 1 to the upper left arm. Hemop pneumothorax on the left side, breath sounds diminished. BP's 70 over palp, heart rate 140. We've got 2 large-bore IVs running wide open, but he's been dropping. They wheeled him in fast. Nora saw him before she registered anything else. The pallor, the neck veins, the shallow labored breathing. And she was already moving, already pulling on gloves, already doing the math in her head before the gurney cleared the threshold. Trauma Bay 2, she said. I need a chest tray and a thoracostomy kit. The paramedic was still talking. Found him outside the parking structure on Delmore Avenue. No ID on him. Bag ventilations? Twice en route, he kept coming back up. Nora leaned over the patient. His eyes were open, barely. She put her face close. Can you hear me? Squeeze my hand if you can hear me. A faint pressure. Barely there. You're at a hospital. We've got you. Stay with me. She looked up and saw the military dog tag, half tucked beneath his torn collar, and something in her brain registered it the way you register a familiar face. Not as information, but as a feeling. She didn't reach for it. Not yet. She had a more immediate problem. His trachea is deviated, she said. This is a tension pneumo. I need a needle, 14 gauge, second intercostal space, mid-clavicular. I'll make that call. Dr. Calder stepped into the bay, snapping on gloves, and the entire energy in the room shifted the way it always did when an attending arrived. The nurses pulled back slightly. The paramedics stepped aside. The invisible hierarchy reasserted itself. Nora didn't move. Tension pneumothorax, she said again, steady. His trachea is shifted right. Breath sounds are absent on the left. He needs needle decompression now, not in 2 minutes. I can see what I'm looking at, Calder said, but there was a fraction of hesitation in his voice that Nora caught. He was looking at the chest. He was recalculating. She stepped back. She handed him the needle. He did it right. She had to give him that. And the rush of air and the almost immediate shift in the patient's breathing confirmed the diagnosis. The room exhaled collectively. But while Calder was managing the chest, Nora was watching the patient's face. She'd seen a lot of trauma in her life, in conditions that made this emergency room look like a spa, and something about this man's presentation wasn't adding up. The wounds were deep but precise, not random violence, and there was something about the way his right hand was positioned, the slight curl of the fingers, like someone who'd spent years training his grip. She reached out and turned the dog tag over. The name on it meant nothing to her, but the unit designation, a small etched notation beneath the name, that meant something. She didn't say it aloud. She just took a quiet breath and kept working. Raymond Holt arrived at 2:31 a.m. He didn't come in an ambulance. He didn't come with a partner. He walked through the emergency bay doors in plain clothes, badge on his belt, and Nora saw him before he saw her. She watched him scan the room, watched his eyes land on the trauma bay, watched something pass over his face, not concern, not urgency, something that looked more like calculation. He walked directly to Dr. Calder. She couldn't hear what they said, but she watched Calder's expression shift, watched him glance toward the patient, watched him nod twice in the way that meant he was agreeing to something he hadn't fully thought through. Then Holt turned and looked directly at Nora. "Who's the nurse running this bay?" he asked. "I am," Nora said. "You're done. Get someone else in here." "I'm in the middle of stabilizing a—" "Get someone else." He said it like he was repeating himself for a slow child. "Now." Calder cleared his throat. "Slade, I'll take it from here. Go ahead and hand off." Nora looked at the patient. His pressure was stabilizing but fragile. His left lung had been decompressed, but the underlying bleed was still a problem. She could see the subtle signs that the fluid in his chest wasn't just air. There was blood pooling. "He needs a chest tube," she said. "He's got a hemopneumothorax, and if we don't—" "Slade," Calder's voice had an edge to it now. "I said I have it." She handed off. She walked out. In the hallway, she stood with her back against the wall and breathed for a moment. The dog tag notation was still in her mind. The precision of the wounds, the positioning of the hand, Holt arriving in plain clothes at 2:31 in the morning for a John Doe with no ID, none of it fit together into anything good. She went back to the nurse's station and pulled up the intake record on her terminal. She documented her assessment: tracheal deviation, absent breath sounds left, needle decompression performed, ongoing concern for hemothorax, and added a nursing note about the plan for a chest tube. She was precise. She was thorough. She kept her opinion out of it and stuck to clinical observation. It took Holt 11 minutes to find the documentation. Who authorized this note? He was standing behind her, which she hadn't heard, which told her she was more exhausted than she'd realized. "I did. It's my clinical assessment from the intake. This patient is involved in an active investigation. Any documentation about him goes through me first. That's not how medical documentation works. I'm telling you how it works tonight." Nora turned in her chair to look at him. "The documentation stays. If there's a legal concern, you can speak to hospital administration and get a court order to have it sealed. Until then, it's part of his medical record." Holt looked at her the way people look at things they're planning to remove. "You really don't know when to stop." "Not usually," she said. He left. She went back to her charting. At 4:45 a.m., she found a message from hospital administration in her inbox, a request to meet with Dr. Lawrence Blankenship, the medical director, at 8 a.m. The subject line read, "Documentation concern, Nurse N. Slade." She slept for 2 hours on the break room couch, set an alarm, and showed up. Blankenship's office smelled like old wood and expensive coffee. He was 60 years old, looked 55, and wore the kind of careful neutrality on his face that career administrators develop as a survival mechanism. He wasn't a bad man, Nora had always thought. He was a man who understood that institutions required maintenance, and that maintenance sometimes meant sacrifice. "Nora," he said, "sit down." She sat. "I want to start by saying that your clinical work here has been, by all objective measures, excellent. Nobody's questioning your competence." Nora said nothing. She'd learned that when someone started a conversation with what they weren't questioning, you waited to find out what they were. "Detective Holt has raised some concerns," Blankenship continued, "about your conduct in the trauma bay last night, about documentation practices, about," how he framed it was, "an interference with an ongoing law enforcement matter." I stabilized a critical patient and documented my assessment, Nora said. That's not interference, that's nursing. He's also raised concerns about a previous interaction regarding the Walker chart. I followed protocol on the Walker chart. No warrant, no release. Blankenship folded his hands on his desk. Nora, I want you to understand that Hargrove has a relationship with the Calverton PD that the hospital values. Detective Holt is not someone we want. Is the patient in Trauma Bay 2 still alive? A pause. I believe he's in the ICU. Yes. He's stable. Then I did my job. She kept her voice level. Whatever concerns Detective Holt has about documentation, I'm happy to have reviewed by the State Nursing Board. I'm also happy to have my chart from last night reviewed by anyone you'd like to bring in. I followed every protocol. Blankenship was quiet for a moment. I'm going to need to put you on administrative leave while we review the situation. She'd half expected it, didn't make it land any easier. How long? I don't know yet, pending the review. And Detective Holt's involvement in this review? Blankenship didn't answer that. She collected her badge from HR at 9:15 a.m. She drove home. She sat in her apartment and looked at the wall for a while, and then she looked at her hands. The hands that had held the needle that had decompressed a dying man's chest. The hands that had recognized a tension pneumo before a physician with 20 years more experience had confirmed it. And she thought about the dog tag. The notation. The way the wounds were placed. She thought about other things she recognized that she wasn't supposed to recognize anymore. On the third day of her leave, Nora drove back to Hargrove. Not to work, not to fight. She went because she'd pulled the patient's name from the intake records before her access was revoked, cross-referenced it with a few databases that a civilian nurse had no business knowing how to access, and confirmed what she'd suspected. The man in Trauma Bay 2, now listed in the ICU under the name James Korath, was not a random victim. The unit designation on his dog tag was from a counterintelligence support unit that had been officially decommissioned 2 years ago. Except Nora knew, because she'd served alongside people connected to it, that decommissioned sometimes meant moved off the books. She didn't know what he was carrying. She didn't know what had gotten him stabbed on Delmore Avenue at 2 in the morning, but she knew that Raymond Holt's immediate appearance at the hospital, his insistence on controlling documentation, his deliberate exclusion of her, a specific nurse, not any nurse, didn't come from standard investigative procedure. It came from someone who knew she might recognize something. She parked down the block from the hospital's side entrance and watched for a while. She saw Holt's car in the lot. Unmarked, but she'd memorized the plate 3 days ago. She saw a second vehicle she didn't recognize, dark blue, government plates that weren't quite standard issue. 2 men in it, not moving. That was when her phone rang. Unknown number. She answered because she'd been the kind of person who answered unknown numbers for a long time, even after she'd tried to stop being that person. Nora Slade? A man's voice, measured, not Holt. Who is this? My name is not something I'm going to give you over the phone, but I think you already know why I'm calling. She watched the dark blue car. One of the men in it shifted slightly. The patient, she said. You recognized the notation. It wasn't a question. She didn't answer it. There are people who need to speak with you, the voice said. Not because of what you did wrong, because of what you know. I'm a nurse on administrative leave, Nora said. I don't know anything. Ms. Slade. A pause. We both know that's not true. In the ICU on the 4th floor of Hargrove Regional Medical Center, James Korath's blood pressure dropped 17 points in 6 minutes. The monitor alarmed. The ICU nurse called for the attending. Dr. Calder arrived, reviewed the vitals, ordered imaging. What he didn't catch was what the imaging wouldn't catch for another 4 hours, was a slow bleed from an intercostal vessel that had been nicked during the initial trauma and had been compensating, barely, ever since. Nora had seen the same presentation twice before, in conditions that had no medical textbooks. She'd flagged it in her original note, the note that was now under review. The phone call ended. Nora sat in her car and looked at the hospital, the building that had suspended her for doing her job. The building where a man was bleeding internally in a way that only she had documented, and felt the particular weight of someone who has tried, genuinely tried, to walk away from what they were. She got out of the car. She was already moving toward the side entrance when the dark blue car's door opened behind her. The man who stepped out of the dark blue car was not what she expected. He was maybe 40, trim, but not military rigid, wearing a jacket that had seen better days and carrying nothing. No folder, no badge visible, no weapon she could clock immediately. He walked toward her at an angle, not a direct line, the way someone does when they don't want to be read as a threat. "Ms. Slade?" Same voice from the phone. "I'd rather not do this in a parking lot." "Then you should have picked a different approach." "Fair." He stopped about 6 feet from her. "My name is Garrett Lund. I work for a federal oversight office that doesn't have a sign on the door. The man upstairs, Korath, he was running an active documentation operation before he was attacked. We believe he was getting close to something. We also believe whoever put him in that hospital knew it." Nora looked at him. "And Holt?" Lund didn't answer right away. That was an answer. "How long has he been involved?" she asked. "We're still building that picture." "That's not a real answer." "No," Lund said. "It's not." He glanced at the hospital entrance, then back at her. "You flagged an intercostal bleed in your nursing note, the note that's currently under administrative review." "I'm aware." "His attending hasn't caught it." She was already moving. Lund fell into step beside her, which she didn't love, but she didn't slow down either. They went through the side entrance. She still had her employee badge. The revocation hadn't filtered through to the physical credential yet, a bureaucratic gap she'd been counting on. The door clicked open. The hallway smelled like antiseptic and recycled air, and something vaguely like burnt coffee from the break room down the corridor. "You can't come upstairs with me," she said. "I know." "Then stay here." She didn't wait to see if he listened. The ICU was on the 4th floor. Nora took the stairs, not the elevator, and used the time to think through what she was about to do. She had no active clinical authority in this building. She was on administrative leave. If anyone recognized her and called Blankenship, this would end before it started, and it would also give Holt exactly the narrative he needed. Unstable nurse, obsessive behavior, harassment of a patient involved in a police matter. She pushed through the stairwell door onto the 4th floor and kept her pace even. The ICU charge nurse that morning was a man named Dwayne Albrecht, who she knew moderately well and liked enough. He was at the central desk when she walked in, and he looked up with the particular expression of someone trying to place whether they should be alarmed. "Nora," he said her name carefully. "You're not... I heard you were... I need you to pull Korath's most recent chest X-ray and compare it to the intake imaging." "That's not... Dwayne." She put both hands on the desk and kept her voice low. "His right intercostal margin. Look at it. If I'm wrong, you never saw me. If I'm right, you've got maybe 2 hours before that bleed becomes a crisis." Dwayne looked at her for a long moment. He was a practical man. She'd seen him make judgment calls before in the gap between what protocol said and what the patient needed. He pulled up the imaging. He went quiet. "That wasn't there on admission," he said. "It was, just smaller. It's been slow. That's why it's been missed." He was already reaching for the phone. She stepped back from the desk before Calder's name got paged. She took the stairs back down, not because she was afraid of being caught, she'd deal with that, but because standing there felt too much like waiting for permission, and she'd already spent 3 days waiting for permission she was never going to get. Lund was exactly where she'd left him, which she noted without commenting on. "He needs a procedure," she said. "They're paging the attending now. He'll live, probably." "Probably." "Medicine isn't math." She stopped walking and turned to face him. "What did Korath document? What was he actually collecting?" "Evidence of a coordinated protection operation," Lund said. "Someone inside Calverton PD has been running interference for a network of individuals involved in, I'm going to be deliberate about how I phrase this, criminal conduct that spans multiple county agencies. Korath was embedded. His cover was getting thin. We think the attack was meant to look random. And Holt is the inside contact." Lund's expression didn't change. "We believe so." "Then why isn't he already arrested?" "Because Korath's documentation was on him when he was attacked. Whatever he was carrying, drive, physical documents, we don't know the format. It wasn't found on his person when the paramedics arrived. Either it was taken or he got rid of it before they got to him. Nora thought about the precise positioning of Korath's right hand, the curl of the fingers, the specific muscle memory of someone who had trained to protect something even when they couldn't protect themselves. He hid it. That's our working theory. Where? That, Lund said, is the part we don't have. She drove home and didn't sleep. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that went cold and thought through everything in sequence. Not because she was looking for something heroic to do, but because her brain had been wired for a long time to look at chaotic information and sort it into a line. The wounds, the hand, Holt's immediate appearance, the dog tag. The specific unit notation that didn't match any of the official records she could access with civilian credentials, but matched something she'd seen in a different context years ago, in a briefing room in a building that didn't appear on maps. She hadn't been a combat medic in the conventional sense. Not just a combat medic. That was the version of her history she'd put on her nursing school application. The accurate version was more complicated, and she'd spent several years since her discharge actively not thinking about it. But some things didn't go away just because you stopped looking at them. She'd been assigned to a special operations medical support team for the last 14 months of her service. The team operated in environments where conventional medical evacuation wasn't possible, where the decision to treat or move or hold was made in seconds by whoever had the most information, and where chain of command sometimes meant the person with the best immediate picture of a situation, not the highest rank in the room. She'd made calls that senior officers had second-guessed afterward and ultimately validated. She'd been effective in a way that made some people deeply uncomfortable, because effectiveness in those environments didn't look the way people expected it to. She'd left because she was tired. That was the simplest truth of it. She'd been tired in a way that sleep didn't touch, and she'd looked at another decade of that life and chosen Calverton, Texas, and a nursing license, and a small apartment with bad water pressure, and a window that faced an alley. She'd been fine. Mostly. She picked up her phone and called Lund's number. He answered on the second ring. "Yeah. Korath's right hand," she said. "When he came in, did anyone document the position of his hand in the paramedic report?" A pause. Papers shuffling. It says, right hand was clenched, fingers partially curled. Noted as possible pain response. It wasn't a pain response. Did anyone check She stopped. Nobody checked under his right arm. The axillary area. Not on the paramedic assessment. Not on intake. Silence. "He was bleeding," she said. "He knew he was going down. If he had something small, a drive, a card, he'd have put it somewhere that a field search wouldn't find immediately. Not his pockets, not his waistband. Somewhere close to his center line, somewhere he could compress with arm position." More silence. Then, "Nora, he's in the ICU. They're about to take him for a procedure." "Then you have a window." "I can't walk into an ICU and search a patient." "No," she said, "but a nurse doing a pre-procedure assessment can do a full skin check." Another pause, longer this time. "This is very far outside what I'm authorized to do," Lund said. "Then find someone who is authorized. You've got maybe 90 minutes before he goes to the OR and gets prepped, and that window closes." She looked at her cold coffee. "I'll be here." She wasn't there. She was back in her car 11 minutes later because sitting still had never actually worked for her no matter how many times she tried it. She parked on the same street as before. She watched the hospital. At 11:40 a.m., she saw two things happen in close enough sequence that she was fairly certain they were connected. Holt's unmarked car left the lot at speed, and a black SUV she hadn't seen before pulled in and parked near the main entrance. 3 people got out. 2 of them were in civilian clothes. The third was in uniform, Army, not local, and the rank insignia was not something she could read from this distance, but the bearing was unmistakable. She'd been around enough people who moved like that to recognize it without the details. She watched them go inside. Her phone buzzed. "Lund." "We found it," he said. "Taped to the inner surface of his upper arm, small drive. He compressed his arm against his side the whole time. The nurses had been working around his arm position because of the IV line on that side." "What's on it?" "I don't know yet. I'm not the one looking at it." A pause. There are people in that building right now who are going to want to talk to you. People who have been looking for the documentation Korath was building. And apparently, he stopped. Apparently what? They knew your name, Lund said. Before I mentioned it, before any of this. One of them recognized your service record and asked specifically if you were involved. Nora looked at the hospital entrance. One of the three people who'd just walked in, the one in uniform, had stopped just inside the doors and turned back to look out at the street, scanning in a way that was automatic and practiced. The scan passed over her car, stopped, came back. She'd parked in shadow, but whoever that was had been trained in the same environment she had, and people trained that way didn't miss things just because the light was bad. Her phone was still at her ear. Lund, she said. The people in the building, who are they? He took a half-second too long to answer. That's a conversation that should probably happen in person. That's not an answer. No, he said, but the person who just looked out the front door and spotted your car? That's someone who served 2 rotations with the same unit notation that was on Korath's dog tag. Her hand tightened on the phone. And, Lund continued, his voice careful, she asked me 20 minutes ago whether Nora Slade was still in Calverton. She stared through the windshield at the figure inside the glass doors. The distance was too far to make out features, but the posture, the weight distribution, the particular stillness of someone who had found what they were looking for and was now simply waiting, hit her somewhere behind the sternum. Who is she? Nora said. Lund said a name. Nora's hand dropped from the phone to her lap. She hadn't heard that name in 4 years, not since a briefing room, not since a mission that had ended in ways that never made it into any official report, not since she'd signed the discharge paperwork and driven south and tried, with everything she had, to become someone who only had to save one person at a time. Inside the hospital entrance, the figure raised one hand. Not a wave, not a greeting, just an acknowledgement. The specific signal of someone who had spent years communicating in spaces where nothing louder was possible. Nora recognized it. Her own hand rose before she decided to raise it. She was already out of the car when she realized she still didn't know if she was walking toward something or away from everything she'd built here. The distinction felt less important than it probably should have, which told her something about herself that she wasn't entirely comfortable with. The morning sun was bright and flat and completely indifferent, and somewhere above her in the ICU of Hargrove Regional, a man who had been left for dead was being kept alive by a procedure that only happened because she'd broken protocol to make sure the right person looked at the right image. And Raymond Holt's car had left the lot at speed, which meant he knew something had shifted, which meant whatever was on that drive was already in motion. She pushed through the front doors and the cold air of the hospital hit her, and the figure in uniform turned to face her fully, and Nora stopped walking for exactly 1 second. The pause of someone who has been braced against something for years and suddenly doesn't know what to do with the absence of resistance. Slade, the woman said. Her voice was the same, exactly the same. Reyes, Nora said. Major Donna Reyes looked at her for a moment, not with the warmth of reunion because neither of them had ever operated that way, but with the specific focus of someone assessing a situation and deciding how much ground they were standing on. Raymond Holt left this building 11 minutes ago, Reyes said. His partner is still somewhere on the 2nd floor. We have people moving on that, but there's a window right now where this could go sideways if the wrong person makes a call. What do you need? Reyes tilted her head slightly. Why does everyone always assume I'm going to ask for something complicated? Because you always do. The corner of Reyes's mouth moved, not quite a smile. Holt has been feeding information about Korath's location to someone outside the department. We think we know who. But the drive Korath was carrying, the documentation, it's encrypted. Korath used a medical notation system for his file structure. We have analysts, but they're not medical analysts. Right. Nora looked at her. You need me to decode the file structure. I need someone who can read a battlefield medical notation system that was used by exactly 4 units in the last 8 years and isn't documented in any open literature, and who also happens to be standing in the right building at the right time. Reyes paused. Yes, I need you. Nora thought about Blankenship's office, the administrative leave paperwork, the way Calder had looked at her when she told him about the tension pneumo. That particular combination of irritation and delayed acknowledgement. 3 days of sitting in her apartment being told, by implication, that she'd overstepped by being right. "I want my documentation cleared," she said. "The nursing notes Holt flagged. I want them restored to Korath's official record." "That's a hospital administration matter." "Then you better start making calls, Major." Reyes studied her for a moment. Then she nodded, once. "Done. And I want to be in the room when you open that drive." "That's going to be a harder conversation." "Have it fast," Nora said, "because Holt left 11 minutes ago and neither of us knows where he went." Reyes moved fast. That hadn't changed. She led Nora past the main reception desk without acknowledging the security guard who started to rise from his chair, through a door marked Authorized Personnel that opened on a keycard Nora didn't ask about, and down a service corridor that smelled like floor wax and old pipes. One of the two civilian-clothed agents fell into step behind them. The other stayed at the lobby entrance, positioned in a way that would look casual to anyone not paying attention. Nora was paying attention. "The drive is in a room on the 3rd floor," Reyes said, walking and talking without slowing for either. "Hospital conference space. Administration cleared it without being told why, which means Blankenship made a call fast and didn't ask questions. I don't know if that makes him smart or scared." "Probably both," Nora said. "The encryption is layered. Korath built it that way on purpose. Outer layer is a standard AES wrapper that's already handled. The interior file structure, the index, the naming convention, it's based on a triage notation system. Our analysts have been staring at it for 40 minutes and can't parse the organizational logic." "Because it's not organizational logic," Nora said. "It's clinical sequence. He would have structured the files the way a field medic structures a patient assessment, not by date or priority, but by presentation order. What he encountered first, what he stabilized, what he flagged for follow-up." Reyes glanced sideways at her. "You can read that." "If he used the system I think he used, yes." They took the stairs to 3. The conference room was a windowless rectangle that someone had tried to make professional with a laminate table and 4 chairs that didn't match. A laptop sat open at the far end, 2 analysts flanking it with the concentrated expressions of people who had stopped pretending they weren't frustrated. A portable drive sat beside the laptop, small and matte black, slightly bent at one corner from however Korath had taped it to his own body. One of the analysts looked up when Nora came in. He clocked her scrubs, her badge, the fact that she wasn't anyone he recognized, and then looked at Reyes. "She's the Reed," Reyes said. He moved without arguing, which told Nora something about how Reyes ran a room. Nora sat down and looked at the screen. The file structure was dense, hundreds of entries organized in a system that would look like chaos to anyone who hadn't spent time in the specific environment where it made sense. But she saw it almost immediately. The logic of it. The clinical mind underneath the operational layer. "He labeled everything as a patient encounter," she said. "The files that are subject entries, he named them the way you'd name a trauma chart. Mechanism of injury first, then the primary complaint, then the assessment stage. These," she pointed at a cluster of files with longer names, "these are the ones where he had enough information to make a working diagnosis. Certainty level coded into the extension." "Can you sort them?" Reyes asked. "Give me a few minutes." She worked. It was not fast and it was not clean. Korath had been thorough, but also clearly operating under pressure toward the end, and some of the later entries were compressed in ways that required interpretation. She sorted by what she understood as his version of a primary survey, identified the entries that represented confirmed intelligence versus working theory versus raw observation, and built a rough index on a notepad beside the laptop. At the center of it was Raymond Holt. But Holt wasn't the architecture of what Korath had been building. He was a load-bearing wall. The structure around him was larger. "There are 6 other names," she said. 2 are county officials. 1 is a state contractor. The other 3 I don't recognize." "We recognize 2 of them," the analyst said, leaning over her shoulder. His voice had shifted. "The 3rd, the name that ends in a numeric suffix, that's a format Korath used for someone he couldn't fully identify. Someone whose actual name he hadn't confirmed. How much does he have on them? Enough to open a federal case. Maybe enough to close one. Reyes stood at the head of the table with her arms crossed, and Nora recognized the look on her face. It was the look of someone running calculations, figuring out which move committed them to a sequence they couldn't reverse. Nora had been on the receiving end of that look once, a long time ago, in a situation where the calculation had gone sideways in ways neither of them had predicted. Holt left the hospital before we found the drive, Nora said, which means he left because of something else, something he knew or found out before we did. His partner's still here, the analyst said. Second floor. We have eyes on him. Does he know you have eyes on him? A pause. We don't think so. Then he's already relayed. Whatever Holt needed him to communicate, it's done. Reyes unfolded her arms. I need to make a call. She stepped out. The room got quieter. Nora looked back at the file structure on the screen. There was one entry she hadn't flagged yet, sitting at the bottom of the sorted list, labeled in Korath's notation system in a way that suggested it was the most recent addition, possibly the last thing he'd added before the attack. The extension code indicated it was raw observation, unconfirmed, but the file size was large. She opened it. It wasn't documents, it was audio. She put in the available headphones and listened for 40 seconds and then took them off. Get Reyes, she said. The analyst looked at her face and went to the door. What Nora had heard was a recording, ambient, not staged, the kind of audio that gets captured on a device left open in a room. Two voices she didn't recognize and one she did. The conversation was partial, clipped, the kind of thing that makes less sense without context and devastating amounts of sense with it. Holt's voice, mid-conversation, saying a specific name in connection with a specific amount of money and a specific date. And then saying, with the flatness of someone discussing logistics, that the problem at the hospital needed to be managed before the shift changed. That recording was made the night Korath was attacked. Reyes came back in. Nora handed her the headphones without speaking. Reyes listened, her expression doing nothing visible, and then she set the headphones on the table and looked at the analyst. How long to get this authenticated and transmitted to the federal prosecutor's office? 2 hours, maybe less? 1, Reyes said. Make it 1. She looked at Nora. You need to leave the building. Holt said the problem at the hospital needed to be managed before the shift change. Nora kept her voice flat. The current shift ends at 3. It's 11:52. Reyes was already moving toward the door. Which is why you need to leave the building. His partner's on the second floor. You said you had eyes on him. We do. Eyes on isn't the same as contained. Nora stood up. Holt's partner doesn't know what we found, but if Holt made a call after he left, the lights in the conference room flickered. Once, briefly, then held. Everyone in the room went still in the specific way of people who have been trained to assign meaning to small anomalies. The analyst's radio crackled, a voice tight and controlled. We've lost visual on the second floor subject. Repeat, the Calverton PD contact is no longer at his last confirmed position. Reyes looked at the laptop, at the drive, at Nora. Go, Nora said. Get the drive out of this building. You'll what? She didn't have a clean answer for that. What she had was a floor plan she'd mentally mapped on the way up, a working knowledge of the hospital's layout from 2 years of shifts, and the particular feeling of a situation contracting around its most important variable. The drive needed to leave. Reyes was the one who could move it through the right channels. That left the second floor. I know where he'd go, Nora said. Holt's partner. If he's moving, he's not going for the exit. He's going for something that changes what we have. That means Korath. The ICU was on 4, the conference room was on 3. The fastest route between them bypassed the nurse's station, but required going through a supply corridor that Nora knew and most people didn't. She was out the door before Reyes could finish the sentence she'd started. The third-floor hallway was quiet in the particular way of mid-morning hospitals. Not empty, but populated with the low-level movement of routine, orderlies, and housekeeping and the occasional visitor moving without urgency. Nobody looked at her twice. She kept her pace brisk but not running, the pace of a nurse who's late for something unremarkable. She took the supply corridor. It was narrow and fluorescent lit and smelled faintly of bleach, and it connected to a service elevator that opened directly outside the ICU family waiting area on 4. She rode up and stepped out and crossed the waiting area without making eye contact with the two families sitting in the plastic chairs against the wall. Through the ICU doors, past the central desk. Dwayne Albrecht was in a patient room, back to her. She moved fast, counting beds from the entrance, finding Korath's bay by the positioning of the monitoring equipment she'd cataloged on her earlier unauthorized visit. He was there. Still intubated post-procedure, sedated, lines running, monitor tracking a heart rate that was more stable than it had any right to be given the last 18 hours. He looked smaller in the bed than he had coming in on the gurney, which they always did. She stood at the foot of his bed and scanned the space. Nothing obviously wrong, no one in the bay who shouldn't be. Then she heard it. Not a sound exactly, more the absence of the right sounds, the particular acoustic gap that happens when a door that should have made noise hasn't. She turned. The man was in scrubs that didn't fit quite right through the shoulders, the tell of someone wearing another person's clothes in a hurry, and he was moving toward the medication cabinet on the far wall of the bay, not toward Korath directly, which was either reassuring or the opposite. He hadn't seen her yet. He was focused on the cabinet. She ran the math in about 2 seconds. He wasn't there to shoot anyone, too loud. He was there to adjust something in the medication line or the drip rate, the kind of intervention that looks like a nursing error after the fact, clean enough if nobody was watching. "Hey," she said. He stopped, turned. He was maybe 35, solidly built, with the specific quality of someone who had trained for physical situations but was currently in a situation that was not physical, and the mismatch was doing something uncomfortable to his expression. "I'm going to need you to step away from that cabinet," Nora said. He looked at her badge, her scrubs, the fact that she was between him and the door. "I work here," he said. "No, you don't." The next 4 seconds happened in a sequence that she would later have difficulty describing in the order it occurred, which was not unusual for situations that moved faster than the narrative part of her brain could track. He moved toward her, not to attack. She clocked it correctly as an attempt to pass. And she stepped sideways into his path in the way she'd been trained to do in environments where restraint of a combative individual required redirecting momentum rather than meeting it. His forward weight went sideways instead of forward. He hit the crash cart instead of her. The crash cart hit the wall. The sound it made was substantial. From the central desk, she heard Dwayne shout. The man recovered faster than she expected. He was trained, not just fit, and he came back toward her with more intent than the first time, and she had the brief, clear thought that this was about to get worse before it got better. Then the ICU doors banged open, and 2 people in civilian clothes came through them at speed, and the calculation in the man's face changed instantly, and he made the decision that people make when the math no longer works in their favor. He stopped moving. "Hands," one of the agents said, and the word had enough weight behind it that he complied. Nora stepped back and let out a breath. Her heart was going considerably faster than she would have preferred. She looked at Korath. The monitor was still tracking. The alarms hadn't triggered. The lines were intact. Whatever the man had been there to do, he hadn't done it. She put one hand on the footrail of the bed and stood there for a moment. Dwayne appeared at the door of the bay, looked at the crashed cart, looked at the man now being very efficiently managed by 2 federal agents, looked at Nora. "I'm going to need you to tell me what is happening in my ICU," he said. "Later," she said. "Right now I need you to have someone check every medication line on this patient." "Nora." "Every line, Dwayne. Document anything that looks like it's been touched." He pressed his lips together the way he did when he was processing something he didn't fully want to accept. And then he went to do it, because Dwayne Albrecht was the kind of nurse who, when push came to catastrophic shove, put the patient first. Her phone buzzed. Reyes. "The drive is out of the building," Reyes said. "We're transmitting now. Holt's partner is contained. 4th floor ICU." A pause. "Are you all right?" He didn't make it to the medication line. "I'm not asking about the line." Nora considered this. "I'm fine." "You're lying, but I'll let it go." A beat. Holt. We just got a GPS ping from his vehicle. He's moving toward the county courthouse. Why? We think he has a contact there. Someone he believes can still intercept the documentation before it hits the federal system. Can they? No, not at this point, but he doesn't know that. Reyes's voice shifted slightly. The specific shift of someone who is about to say something they mean. The recording you found, Nora. The audio file. That's the piece we didn't have. We had financial records, we had witness statements, we had Korath's observation notes. But we didn't have Holt's voice. Not on anything. Korath knew, Nora said. She was looking at the man in the hospital bed. The slow rise and fall of chest, the numbers on the monitor stabilizing in the incremental way of someone who has decided, on some biological level, to keep going. He knew that all the documentation in the world wouldn't be enough without something that couldn't be explained away. He was right. Another beat. We're going to need you to give a formal statement about the documentation, the file structure, the notation system. It will be part of the evidentiary record. I know. And Blankenship. He's asking questions about what happened in his hospital this morning. He's going to have more questions when this hits the news. Probably. Reyes paused. Your nursing notes have been restored to Korath's official chart. All of them. The administrative leave is... I've been told that's being reviewed. Reviewed, Nora said flatly. It's the word they used. I'm going to make sure it means what it should mean. She hung up. The ICU settled back into its rhythm. Not all at once, not smoothly, but in the gradual way that institutions settle after something has passed through them. The agents moved Holt's partner toward the elevator with the quiet efficiency of people who did this often enough to have a process. Dwayne was at Korath's bedside with another nurse, checking lines and documentation with the careful attention of someone who understood what the stakes were now. Nora stood in the hallway outside the ICU and looked at the wall. She was tired. That was the honest word for it. Not the performing exhaustion of someone who wanted to be noticed, but the specific bone-deep fatigue of someone who had held a situation together through friction and sheer refusal for longer than was sustainable. Her hands were steady. They were always steady. That hadn't changed since the first deployment, but the rest of her was catching up to the morning. Her phone buzzed again. Not Reyes this time. An unknown number, different from Lund's. She answered. Silence. Then breathing. Then a voice. Not Holt, not Lund, not anyone she recognized, low and deliberate and containing, underneath its control, something that sounded like a man recalculating a position he'd held for a long time. Ms. Slade, the voice said, I think it's time we spoke directly. The name he gave when she asked who was calling matched one of the 6 names on Korath's drive. Not Holt, not a county official. The state contractor, the unaffiliated name, the one that appeared in the financial records as a pass-through, the one she'd flagged without recognizing its full significance. I'm listening, she said, and kept her voice exactly as flat as she needed it to be. There's information on that drive, he said, that you haven't fully processed yet. Information that concerns people you don't want to have concerned. I want to have a conversation before this goes further. Nora looked down the hallway. Fluorescent light. Linoleum. A cart with breakfast trays that nobody had moved yet. The sound of a monitor from inside the ICU, marking the steady intervals of a man who was alive because she'd looked at an X-ray and made a call 3 floors up and an hour ago. Where? She said. He gave her an address. Not a government building. Not a public space. A private address on the north end of Calverton, the kind of area where the houses had long driveways and the neighbors weren't close enough to see anything. 1 hour, he said. She said nothing for long enough that he added, Ms. Slade, I heard you, she said, and hung up. She looked at the phone in her hand. She could call Reyes. That was the logical move. Relay the number, let the federal apparatus handle the contact, insert herself into a controlled operation with people who had resources and authorization and backup. She should call Reyes. She pulled up the address he'd given, mapped it in her head, and started walking toward the elevator. She was almost to the ground floor when her phone buzzed with a message from a number she didn't recognize. A different, unknown number. Not the man who'd called, not Lund, not Reyes. Just 4 words and a set of coordinates that matched exactly the address the man had given her. The 4 words were, "Do not go alone." She called Reyes from the elevator, not because she'd changed her mind about going, because the 4-word message told her someone else already knew about the meeting, which meant she was already a variable in someone else's calculation. And walking into that without a second set of eyes was the kind of mistake she'd seen other people make in conditions far more forgiving than this one. Reyes picked up on the first ring. "Where are you?" "Ground floor, I need to tell you something fast." She relayed the call, the voice, the address, the 1-hour window. Then she took a photo of the 4-word message and sent it through. Silence on the line while Reyes looked at it. Then, "That number. Hold on." Nora stepped out of the elevator into the main lobby. The agent who'd been stationed near the entrance was still there, positioned differently now, facing inward. He caught her eye briefly and looked away. "The number that sent you that message," Reyes said. "It's registered to a federal communications relay. Not ours. Different office." "Which office?" "Working on it." A pause that contained more activity than silence usually did. "Nora, the address he gave you, it's registered to a holding company that we've been tracing through Korath's financial documentation. It's not a private residence, it's a staged location." "I know. You know." "He gave me an hour. Nobody gives an hour for a private conversation. That's enough time to set up, not enough time to relocate if something goes wrong. He wants me there because he thinks I'm the variable he can still manage." She looked at the lobby doors. Sunlight on asphalt. "He doesn't know what we pulled from the drive. Or he knows exactly what we pulled and wants to make you an offer before it matters. Either way, I'm not going in alone." "You're not going in at all," Reyes said. "I'm sending—" He called me specifically. "Not you, not Lund, me." She kept her voice even. "If federal vehicles pull up to that address, he disappears. Whatever he's still holding disappears with him. The drive has documentation, but you said yourself the 3rd name on Korath's list is still incomplete. This is how you complete it." Another silence. This one had a different texture. "You'd be going in without a wire cleared through proper channels," Reyes said. "Anything you get in that room, I know the rules." "Then you know it's complicated." "I know it's the only move that doesn't let him walk." She stood at the lobby doors. "Get someone to the north end of Calverton, not on the block, not visible, and send me everything Korath had on the contractor, all of it, so I'm not walking in without knowing what he thinks I know." Reyes exhaled slowly. "This is not how I wanted this morning to go." It wasn't my first choice either. She had 43 minutes. She used 12 of them sitting in her car in the hospital parking lot, reading through the files Lund transmitted to her phone. A condensed version of Korath's documentation on the contractor, a man named Stillwell, first name Warren. 61 years old. Former state budget officer, transitioned into private consulting 12 years ago. His firm handled infrastructure contracts across 4 counties, and buried inside the billing structures for those contracts was a pattern that Korath had spent 14 months mapping, payments routed through a series of LLCs to individuals inside law enforcement and county government who ensured that certain investigations stayed slow, certain evidence stayed lost, and certain people stayed protected. Holt had been the enforcement layer. Stillwell was the money. She drove north. The address was a property that had the bones of a renovated farmhouse, but felt unoccupied in the specific way of spaces maintained for purpose rather than residence. Clean lines, no personal detail, nothing on the walls visible through the windows. Long gravel driveway. No vehicles visible from the road, which meant either he'd hidden them or he'd arrived differently, or she was early enough that he hadn't committed yet. She parked on the driveway rather than the street, which was a deliberate choice. Visible, not hidden, the body language of someone who wasn't trying to approach without being seen. She took her phone and nothing else. She walked to the front door and knocked. Warren Stillwell opened it himself, which told her there was no one else inside, or he wanted her to think that. He was smaller than she'd expected. People who move large amounts of money and influence tend to accrete a kind of imagined physical weight in the mind. He was maybe 5'10", trim, dressed in the careful casual way of someone who'd decided what to wear with some thought. His face was the face of a man who had been managing situations for a long time and was currently managing one more. Miss Slade, he said, thank you for coming. Let's skip the part where this is a polite conversation, she said. What do you want? He stepped back to let her in. She went through the threshold and positioned herself so that the door was to her left and the room's sightlines were in front of her. Living space, open plan, nobody else visible. He sat. She didn't. The drive that your colleagues recovered this morning, he said. I want you to understand what's actually on it. I read it. You read what Korath assembled. Korath had a specific perspective. He was thorough, but he had a frame, and everything he documented was filtered through that frame. He folded his hands. His voice had the quality of someone who'd given versions of this speech before. Not rehearsed, but settled. Some of what's there is accurate. Some of it is accurate data assembled toward an inaccurate conclusion. The financial relationships he documented were not what they appear. 6 people took money, Nora said, including you, to protect a network of criminal activity across 4 county agencies. Korath documented the payments, the routing, and the outcomes. The outcomes being specific investigations that stalled, specific evidence that was never logged, specific individuals who were arrested and released without charge in ways that aren't consistent with the evidence available. Stillwell looked at her. His expression didn't change dramatically. You're more familiar with the contents than I expected. You had an hour to set this up. I had 40 minutes to read. She watched him. What's the offer? There's information on that drive that points toward individuals who are significantly more central to what you're describing than I am. My role was... He paused, and she had the sense he was choosing words not for deception, but for something more complicated. The specific self-negotiation of a person who has been telling themselves a manageable version of their own story for a long time. I was a facilitator. The architecture of what Korath documented was built by someone who isn't in those files. The third name, she said. Something moved across his face. Korath couldn't confirm it, she said. He had the financial fingerprint, the pattern of how money moved upstream from your operation. But he didn't have a name. You have the name. Stillwell looked at his hands. If I give you a name, he said, I need something in return. I'm not a federal prosecutor. No, but you're standing in a room with me voluntarily, which means the federal prosecutors sent you because they know I won't talk to them directly, which means you have more standing in this negotiation than you're representing. He looked up. I want a cooperation agreement. Formal, documented, before I say anything further. That takes time I don't have, and attorneys you'd need to... I have the attorneys. He said it without inflection. I've had them on standby for 6 weeks, since I understood where Korath's investigation was heading. He reached toward the side table and picked up a phone, turned it to show her. A number already pulled up, not yet dialed. 1 call. They'll be here in 40 minutes. Nora looked at the phone. At Stillwell. At the room. You've been planning to cooperate, she said. I've been planning for multiple outcomes. He set the phone back down. When Holt told me 2 days ago that there was a nurse at the hospital who had flagged Korath's chart, had recognized something in his presentation that nobody else caught. I'll tell you honestly, Ms. Slade, my first instinct was concern. My second instinct was that anyone who could do that in those circumstances was someone who might understand that the situation is more layered than it looks from the outside. She stood there for a moment. Holt told you about me specifically? Yes. By name? Yes. Something settled into place that had been slightly out of alignment since the beginning. How did Holt know who I was? Specifically. Not just the nurse on duty, or my name, my background. There's no reason a Calverton PD detective would have a reason to pull my service record unless someone told him to look, Stillwell said. He said it quietly, and with the specific quality of someone delivering information they've already decided to deliver. She waited. The person above me in this structure, he said. The name that isn't in Korath's files. They knew about you before any of this. Not because of this hospital, not because of Korath, for another reason. He looked at her steadily. A reason that goes back further than the last 2 weeks. Her phone buzzed. She didn't look at it. Make the call, she said. Get your attorneys. I'll get the right people here. She held his gaze. But you're going to tell me the name first. Stillwell considered this for a long moment. Then he said the name. She'd heard it once, 4 years ago, in a briefing room that didn't appear on maps. It was the name of a person who had been, at the time, tangentially connected to the operation her unit had been supporting. Not an operative, not a government official in any formal sense, but someone described as a facilitating contact, someone who moved between the civilian and military contracting world with the kind of access that resulted from years of knowing where the seams were. She hadn't thought about that name since. She hadn't had reason to. She thought about it now. She stepped outside to make the call to Reyes, and while she was on the driveway with the gravel under her shoes and the flat Texas sky overhead, she heard the sound of vehicles on the road. Not visible yet, but close. The specific engine note of something larger than a standard passenger car moving at speed. Reyes, when she picked up, didn't wait for Nora to speak. "We have a problem. Holt didn't go to the courthouse." "Where did he go?" "We lost his GPS. Vehicle was found abandoned 3 blocks from the courthouse, engine still running. He's on foot somewhere in Calverton, and we don't have eyes." Nora looked at the gravel driveway, the road at the end of it, the approaching sound. "He knows about this address," she said. "Stillwell told me Holt was the one who flagged me. Holt knows Stillwell is the next link in the chain. And if Holt gets to Stillwell before we do—" "I'm at the address right now," Nora said. "Stillwell is inside. He's ready to cooperate. Get someone here." "I have 2 vehicles 12 minutes out. The sound I'm hearing might not give us 12 minutes. A pause. "Nora, get inside and stay away from the windows." She went inside. Stillwell looked at her face when she came back through the door, and something in his expression shifted. The composed quality dropping slightly, the man underneath it a little less certain. "What's happening?" "Holt isn't accounted for." He stood up. For the first time, she saw something underneath the managed exterior. Not panic, but the specific fear of a man who understood, suddenly and concretely, that the variables he'd been calculating had not included this one. "Holt won't—" He stopped. Started again. "He's protected by this arrangement as much as I am. He has no reason to—" "He was the enforcement layer," Nora said. "You were the money. If he's been told the drive is in federal hands, his calculation changes. You're not a partner anymore. You're a witness." The color in Stillwell's face made a specific shift. She moved to the window, staying to the side, not in the glass, and looked at the driveway. Nothing visible yet. The engine sound had gotten closer and then seemed to have stopped, which was either the vehicles pulling off before the property or something she didn't want to think about too carefully. "Is there another exit?" she asked. "Kitchen. Back door opens to a utility yard." "Is it fenced?" "Chain link. Gate at the far end." She processed that. "Your attorneys, how far out are they actually?" "I may have overstated the 40 minutes. She looked at him. "How far?" He had the grace to look slightly ashamed. "They're in Austin." She almost said something about that, decided it wasn't the moment. She kept her position at the window and watched the driveway and thought through the geometry of the situation. Stillwell as a witness who was ready to name the architect of something larger than what the drive contained. Holt, as a man who understood that witnesses value and had the training and the motive to reduce it, and her as the person standing between them with no official authority, a suspended nursing badge, and the particular skill set of someone who had spent years being the last line between a patient and what was coming for them. The front window cracked. Not broke, cracked. A single fracture line spreading from a point of impact in the upper right pane, the kind of fracture produced by something small and fast. The sound that followed was delayed and quiet, the report of something suppressed reaching them a half-second after the fact. Nora was already moving. "Get down. Kitchen. Now." Stillwell moved faster than she expected a 61-year-old man to move, which she noted was something that wasn't quite satisfaction, but was close to it. She followed him low, below the window line, through the open-plan living space into the kitchen. The back door was steel core, solid, good. She checked the utility yard through the narrow window beside the door. Chain link, the gate visible at the far end, closed. Her phone buzzed. "Reyes, ETA 8 minutes. Stay in structure." She typed back. "Shooter, suppressed. Front of property. 3 seconds." Then, Moving faster. 5 minutes. Do not engage. Stillwell was crouched beside the kitchen island, and he was looking at her with an expression that had finally dropped all of the managed composure. Just a man in a situation that had resolved itself into something very simple and very immediate. "You're not just a nurse," he said. Not an accusation. Almost wonder. "Right now I'm whatever gets you to those 5 minutes," she said. She looked at the back door, the utility yard, the fence, the gate. Then she looked at the door to the utility yard and noticed what she should have noticed immediately. Shadow, wrong angle, wrong movement on the far side of the gate. Not visible through the chain link yet, but present. Holt had not come alone. She turned back to Stillwell and crouched beside him. How many people knew about this address? He looked at the shadow she'd indicated. His jaw set. 3, he said. Myself. Holt. And the person whose name I gave you. Her phone was already dialing before he finished the sentence, but Reyes wasn't picking up. The call was connecting and dropping, which in her experience meant the signal was being interfered with deliberately and locally, which was a level of operational preparation that changed her read of how much time they actually had. She put the phone in her pocket and looked at Warren Stillwell, a man who had spent 12 years being the invisible architecture of something corrupt and had, in the last 40 minutes, decided to become the thing that dismantled it. And she said, with the specific calm of someone who had been here before in worse conditions, "Stay close to me and do exactly what I say when I say it. Can you do that?" He nodded. Outside, the gate to the utility yard began, slowly and with great deliberateness, to open. And in that moment, her phone buzzed one final time, not a call. A text from Reyes's number that read only, "Look at the name Stillwell gave you. Look at where they were 8 years ago. It's not just about the money, Nora. It never was." She read it again. The gate was fully open now, and the person who walked through it was not Raymond Holt. The person who walked through the gate was a woman. She was somewhere in her mid-50s, dressed in civilian clothing that fit the way civilian clothing fits people who don't normally wear it, slightly wrong in the arms, slightly too considered. Her hair was gray at the temples and darker elsewhere, cut practically. She moved without hurry, which was either confidence or calculation, and her hands were visible and empty, which meant nothing by itself. Nora didn't recognize her face. She recognized the way she moved. The woman stopped in the middle of the utility yard, looked at the back door with the specific patience of someone who knew she was being watched and was comfortable with it, and said, at a volume calibrated to carry through a door without carrying further, "Miss Slade, I'm not here to hurt anyone. I need you to hear that before anything else happens." Stillwell, crouched beside Nora, made a sound low in his throat. Not surprise. Something older than that. "You know her," Nora said. Not a question. "Her name is Carla Voss," he said. "She ran the contracting division for a regional infrastructure authority 8 years ago, before she—" He stopped. His jaw worked. "Before she transitioned to a different kind of work." Carla Voss. Not a name from Korath's files. Not a name from any of the documentation Lund had sent her. The name Stillwell had given her 20 minutes ago in the living room, spoken quietly and with the weight of someone releasing something they'd held for a long time. The architect. Nora looked at the back door, at the yard, at the woman standing in it with her hands open and her face turned toward the door as though she could see through it. She thought about what Reyes's text had said. It's not just about the money. And look at where they were 8 years ago. 8 years ago, Nora had been in her last year of service. The operation her unit had supported, the one with the briefing room that didn't appear on maps, the one she'd signed papers about and then filed somewhere in herself she rarely opened, had intersected, briefly and without full clarity, with a civilian contracting operation that was providing logistical support to a counterterrorism initiative in the region. She'd seen a name on a document. She hadn't thought about it afterward because there was no reason to. There was a reason now. She stood up, unlocked the back door, and opened it. Carla Voss looked at her for a moment, taking in the scrubs, the badge, the posture, and something in her expression shifted, not softening exactly, more like the adjustment of someone who had prepared for one version of a confrontation and was now revising in real time. "You're younger than I expected," Voss said. "You tried to have us shot through a window," Nora said. "That wasn't Holt?" Holt panicked when he understood the drive had been found. "I stopped him before he did anything he couldn't take back." She said it with the flat pragmatism of someone describing a management decision. "The shot through the window was a warning. If I wanted either of you hurt, you'd already be hurt. That's not reassuring. It's not meant to be reassuring. It's meant to be accurate." Voss looked past Nora at Stillwell, who had gotten to his feet and was standing in the kitchen doorway with an expression that sat somewhere between relief and something more complicated. "Warren, you gave them my name." "Yes," he said. A silence. "I know." She looked back at Nora. "He was always going to. That's the thing about building a structure on people. Eventually the people decide what the structure is for." She said it without visible bitterness. That was somehow worse than bitterness would have been. "The federal vehicles will be here in approximately 3 minutes. I'd like to use those 3 minutes." "To say what?" Nora asked. "To say that what Korath documented is accurate. All of it, including the parts that point back to me. I'm not here to dispute it or negotiate around it. I made the choices I made. I built what I built, and I've known for approximately 4 months that it was going to end." She looked at Nora steadily. "What I want to say, what I need to say before this becomes an official record, is that the operation your unit supported 8 years ago, the one you signed papers on, you need to understand that what I was doing then and what this became are not the same thing." Nora waited. "It started as something I believed in," Voss said. "The contracting work, the infrastructure. The relationships I built with people like Holt, those started as practical, as management of a complicated operating environment. And then," she stopped. For the first time, something showed in her face that wasn't managed. "It didn't stay that way." "It never does," Nora said. "No." A pause. "No, it doesn't." The sound of vehicles on the gravel came clearly through the still air, and all 3 of them heard it, and Carla Voss didn't move. She stood in the middle of the utility yard in the flat Texas sunlight and looked like a woman who had finally stopped calculating the distance to the next position. "I'll cooperate," she said. "Fully. Everything I know about how this was built, who was involved, how the money moved, all of it." She looked at Nora one more time. "Your nursing notes, the ones that were flagged, they were right." Nora held her gaze. "I know. I mean, they were right about more than Korath's chest. The documentation you created about Holt's interference, the procedural notes, the timeline, that's going to matter in ways you don't fully know yet." Before Nora could respond, the gate swung wide and the yard filled with movement. Reyes first, 2 agents behind her, and behind them a man in federal prosecutor's credentials who was already holding a phone and talking into it, and looking at Carla Voss with the expression of someone who has been waiting to be in this yard for a significant amount of time. Reyes stopped beside Nora, looked at the yard, looked at Voss. "She came voluntarily?" Reyes asked quietly. "She came," Nora said. "You can argue about the voluntarily part later." Raymond Holt was arrested at 1:47 p.m., 2.5 miles from where he'd abandoned his vehicle, trying to cross into a neighboring county on foot through a drainage corridor that ran beneath the interstate. He'd been in law enforcement long enough to know the gaps in coverage, and he found one, and then he found 2 federal agents on the other side of it who had been waiting there specifically because Carla Voss, in her first 20 minutes of cooperation, had described exactly which corridor a man with Holt's training and his particular history in this county would use. Nora heard about it from Lund, who called her while she was sitting in the front seat of a federal vehicle in the driveway of the property on the north side of Calverton, filling out the first of what would turn out to be 11 hours of formal statements across 3 days. "He didn't say anything when they took him," Lund said. "He's been a cop for 18 years, she said. "He knows not to." "You okay?" She looked at the farmhouse property, the cracked front window, the gravel, the vehicles filling what had been a quiet driveway an hour ago. "Ask me in a week." "Bear," Lund said and hung up. "And The formal interview with the federal prosecutor's office happened the following morning in a conference room in a building in downtown Calverton that had a sign on the door and fluorescent lighting that buzzed at a frequency just below perception. Two attorneys, a federal agent she hadn't met before, and a court reporter who typed with the efficient silence of someone who had stopped registering the content of what they recorded. Nora walked them through everything in sequence: the intake on Korath, the assessment, Holt's interference, the documentation she'd filed, and the administrative process that had been used to remove her from the case in the hospital, the drive, the file structure, the audio file, the utility yard. She was precise. She left out nothing that was relevant and included nothing that wasn't. At one point, the federal attorney across from her leaned back slightly and said, "The nursing notes that were filed under administrative review, you maintained at every stage that those were accurate clinical documentation." "They were," Nora said. "And the documentation of Holt's interference with your clinical function, you filed that at 4:53 a.m. on the morning of the incident while on duty during a double shift." "Yes." He looked at her for a moment. "That took some nerve." "It took a pen and a computer," she said, "and the knowledge that I was right." He nodded and moved on. But she caught him make a small notation on his legal pad that wasn't a question, and she understood that some things are recorded not because they're legally necessary, but because the person recording them thinks they should exist somewhere. The press got hold of it 4 days later. Not the full story. That would take weeks to fully emerge, trickling out through court filings and official statements, and the particular way federal corruption cases unspool when multiple parties are cooperating and the documentation is extensive. But the broad shape of it: a Calverton PD detective arrested on federal charges, a state contractor cooperating with a federal investigation into corruption across 4 county agencies, a military counterintelligence operative who'd been attacked while building an evidentiary case that had been found and preserved. The hospital's connection came out on day 6. The Calverton Register ran it first. A reporter named Will Okafor, who had the specific quality of a journalist who actually read the court filings instead of just the summaries. His article was careful and detailed, and named Holt's interference at Hargrove Regional specifically, named the administrative action taken against a nurse who had documented that interference, named the administrative action as a documented element of the obstruction case. It didn't name Nora. She'd asked the prosecutors to keep her name out of the initial filings where possible. They'd done what they could. It wasn't enough. By day 8, there were 3 more articles, 2 local news segments, and a call from a regional television journalist to her cell phone that she let go to voicemail. She was back at Hargrove by then, not on duty. Her reinstatement was still an administrative process, which had the specific irony of being exactly as slow and bureaucratic as every other administrative process she'd ever dealt with, even when the outcome was no longer in question. But she was there because Dwayne Albrecht had called her and said that James Korath had been moved out of the ICU and was asking if the nurse who'd been to see him while he was sedated was available. She went. He was in a standard room on the 3rd floor, sitting up, still with more lines than she'd want for a man in his recovery stage, but fewer than he'd had a week ago. He was thinner than she'd expected, having only known him horizontal and unconscious. He had a quality of alertness that was specific. The kind of person who, even in a hospital bed, in a Johnny gown with a chest tube recently removed, was cataloging the room. She recognized it. "Slade," he said. "Korath. They told me about the axillary tape." He looked at her with an expression that contained more than he was likely to say out loud. "You figured that out from intake." The hand position. She sat down in the visitor chair. Field medics do the same thing. Hide something you can't afford to lose somewhere close and central where a pat-down goes fast. He nodded. "Where'd you serve?" She told him the broad outline. Not the classified specifics, not the operation name, but the unit type, the time frame, the regions. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Rhea said you walked into that property on the north side alone." "I walked in with a phone and an exit strategy." "That's not the same as backup." "No," she said, "it's not." He looked at his hands, which were healing in the slow way of hands that had been compressed against a wound for 11 minutes on a parking structure floor. The recording, the audio file. "I knew that was the piece that mattered most. I knew if I went down, I needed it somewhere they couldn't find easily. I almost... He stopped. His jaw tightened. I almost didn't make it to where I could hide it. I know. You got there in time. She didn't answer immediately. The thing about that statement was that it was true, and it was also incomplete. She'd gotten there in time because she'd pushed against a process that was designed to remove her, because she'd read an X-ray without authority, because she'd gone back to a building where she'd been administratively expelled and read a medical notation system on a screen while federal agents waited. Getting there in time had not been a single decision. It had been 11 consecutive decisions made in the gap between what she was permitted to do and what needed to happen. You should rest, she said. He almost smiled. Coming from the woman who worked a double shift before any of this started. Exactly, she said. I know what I'm talking about. She stood up to go. At the door, he said her name. She turned. The drive. He looked at her steadily. You know what it takes to build that kind of documentation. 14 months of it, in the kind of environment where if anyone found out what you were doing, they'd... He stopped. Most people would have stopped. A lot of people would have never started. You didn't stop, she said. Neither did you. He held her gaze. When they put you on administrative leave for filing an accurate nursing note, when Holt stood in your department and told you to stop existing in it, you didn't stop. I went home, she said. I sat in my apartment and stared at a wall for a while. And then you didn't stop. She held his gaze for a moment, then she nodded once and left. Dr. Lawrence Blankenship called her to his office on day 11. The office smelled the same, old wood, expensive coffee. He looked, for the first time in the 2 years she'd worked at Hargrove, like a man who was slightly less certain of the ground beneath his chair than he'd been before. Nora, he said. Sit down. She sat. Your administrative leave is formally rescinded, effective today. He slid a document across the desk. All documentation associated with it has been expunged from your personnel file. The nursing notes that were flagged are restored to Korath's official medical record in their original form. She picked up the document. Read it. The nursing notes were never inaccurate, she said. That's not a restoration. That's a correction. He met her eyes. He was not a bad man. She still believed that. You're right, he said. It's a correction. She put the document back on the desk. I want something else. He waited. The policy that allowed Holt to interface with clinical staff and access patient care areas without documented authorization. I want that reviewed and updated, not because of what happened specifically, but because the gap existed and he knew to use it. Someone else will know to use it again if it stays. Blankenship looked at her for a moment. That would require a policy review committee. I know. She held his gaze. I'd like to be on it. A pause. I think that can be arranged. She stood up. At the door, he said, Nora? She stopped. What you did, the clinical work, the documentation, and then the rest of it. I want you to know that this institution failed to protect you when it should have. She looked at him. He meant it. She could tell he meant it, which made it both better and slightly more complicated to receive. I know, she said. Don't let it fail the next one. Raymond Holt was formally charged 12 days after his arrest on 3 federal counts: obstruction of justice, abuse of official position, and conspiracy in connection with the network Korath had documented. The charges carried a combined exposure that Nora, reading the court filings on her phone during a break in a 12-hour shift, calculated at somewhere between 12 and 20 years, depending on what the cooperation agreements of the other parties produced. He hadn't spoken publicly. His attorney had released a statement that said the minimum number of words allowable without saying nothing at all. The Calverton PD had placed him on unpaid suspension pending the outcome, which was the institutional version of looking at something and waiting for it to go away, except this particular thing was not going to go away. 3 of the 6 names on Korath's drive entered cooperation agreements within the first 2 weeks. The 2 county officials moved quickly, the kind of speed that suggested they'd had contingency plans ready. Warren Stillwell's cooperation was the most extensive and produced the most additional documentation. filling in the gaps that Korath hadn't been able to close before the attack. Carla Voss was charged separately. The federal indictment against her ran to 19 pages and covered a span of 8 years. She pled not guilty at the arraignment, which her attorney had advised, and she looked in the courtroom photographs like a woman who had made a decision about how to face something and was living inside that decision with whatever passed for composure when composure is all you have left. Nora didn't feel satisfaction when she read the indictment. She felt something quieter than that. The absence of a pressure she'd been holding without fully recognizing how constant it had been. Not victory, more like the specific sensation of putting down something heavy and realizing you've been carrying it for longer than you knew. Reyes came back to Calverton 3 weeks after the arrests, ostensibly for a debrief with the federal prosecutors and a review of the evidentiary record. She found Nora in the Hargrove cafeteria on a lunch break, eating a sandwich that she hadn't started and reading the infection control policy update that the committee had circulated that morning. Reyes sat down across from her without being invited, which was exactly what she would have done 4 years ago. "You look tired," Reyes said. "I'm working 12-hour shifts," Nora said. "This is what not tired looks like for me right now." Reyes picked up the policy document, scanned the first page, set it back down. "You're on a policy committee." "I am. And seeing patients. That is what working at a hospital involves." Reyes looked at her for a moment with that particular focus. Not assessing a situation now, just looking. "We're building something," she said. "Not the unit we were with before. Something different, smaller, more specialized. It would involve some field work, but it's based out of a fixed location. Medical component is significant." Nora ate a corner of her sandwich. "No." "You haven't heard." "I know what you're offering," she said. "And I know you, which means the version you're describing is the version you think I'll hear before you get to what it actually entails." She set the sandwich down. "I'm not coming back to that. I meant it when I left." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "You're really going to stay here? Calverton, 12-hour shifts, policy committees." "Somebody has to fix the documentation protocol in this building," Nora said. "And the charge nurse said they're going to have a skills day for the new emergency grads next month. They asked if I'd run the trauma assessment portion." "You're going to teach triage to new graduates." "I'm going to make sure the next nurse who identifies a tension pneumo in a chaotic intake knows exactly how to document it so nobody can touch it." She looked at Reyes steadily. "That matters. Maybe not the way it mattered to you before, but it matters." Reyes looked at her for a long time. Something in her expression moved. Not the working look, not the tactical assessment. Something older and less guarded than that. "You were the best person I had," she said, "in those 14 months. The best." "I know," Nora said. It wasn't arrogance. It was just the specific acknowledgement of a fact that she'd carried without being able to state it for a long time, because stating it felt like something she hadn't earned the right to. She was done with that. "I also know I was burning out in a way that was going to make me dangerous eventually, and I know what I'm good for here." Reyes nodded, once. The nod of someone who disagrees but respects the ground they're disagreeing with. "The skills day," Reyes said. "The new grads. You're going to tell them about the tension pneumo case?" "I'm going to tell them about documentation," Nora said. "I'm going to tell them that the clinical note you file at 4:53 in the morning when you're exhausted and someone in authority is telling you to back down, that note can be the thing that holds everything together weeks later when the situation is bigger than you understood it to be in the moment you wrote it." She picked up the rest of her sandwich. "And I'm going to tell them that the people who try to remove you for being right, they're counting on you deciding it isn't worth it. That's the only way it works for them. The moment you decide it's worth it, the whole structure they built on your silence starts to come apart." Reyes sat with that for a moment. Then she stood up, picked up the infection control policy document, and handed it back across the table. "Good luck with the committee," she said. "I don't need luck," Nora said. "I need better signage on the medication storage rooms. I'm taking that to admin next week." Reyes almost laughed. She covered it well, but not completely. She walked out of the cafeteria, and Nora watched her go and then went back to the policy document and the second half of her sandwich. James Korath was discharged from Hargrove Regional Medical Center on a Tuesday morning, 31 days after arriving unconscious on a gurney at 2:17 a.m. with a collapsed lung and a drive taped to his arm, and the particular stubbornness of a man who had decided that the thing he was carrying was worth dying for, and then had decided, somewhere in the dark chemistry of a body fighting to stay alive, not to die. He walked out under his own power. He was thinner than he'd be in 6 months and slower than he'd be in a year, and he carried himself with the careful deliberateness of someone relearning the relationship between intention and movement. Nora was at the nurse's station when he came through, and he stopped. "Going home," he said. "I know. I signed the discharge paperwork." He looked at her. "I looked up your service record, the parts that aren't classified." A pause. 14 months is a long time to do what you did. You did 14 months of a different kind of the same thing. He considered that. Yeah. He adjusted the strap of the bag on his shoulder. A small wince, not quite suppressed, the chest still teaching him where its limits were. "The skills day next month. Dwayne told me about it." Dwayne talks too much. "He said you're running the trauma assessment section." "I am." Korath looked at her for a moment. "Would you be willing to add a component on recognizing signs of interference with patient care, specifically in high-stakes intake situations where outside parties are attempting to—" "Yes," she said. He nodded. "Good." He paused again, and she had the sense he was looking for a way to say something that didn't have a clean form yet. People who spent years documenting things for other people sometimes had difficulty when the thing they wanted to document was personal. "You didn't have to come back to this building when you were on leave. You didn't have to look at that x-ray. You didn't have to do any of the things after that." "I know," she said. "Why did you?" She thought about it. Actually thought about it, not the surface version that sounded right, but the actual reason that sat underneath. "Because the note I filed was accurate," she said. "And accurate things shouldn't disappear just because someone with more authority wants them to." He stood with that for a moment. Then he said simply, "Thank you," and walked toward the exit, and she watched him go, and she went back to work. The skills day happened on a Thursday in mid-October, in the education room on the second floor that smelled like dry erase marker and aging upholstery. 11 new emergency nurses, most of them in their mid-20s, all of them in the specific state of people who are competent enough to have been hired and aware enough to know they have things to learn. Nora ran the trauma assessment section for 90 minutes. She covered primary surveys, tension pneumothorax, chest decompression, hemothorax, the specific sounds and visual cues that appear in the gap between knowing what something is and being certain enough to act. She was direct and specific, and did not soften the difficult parts. The moments when the right call requires going against what someone with more authority is telling you. The moments when your documentation is the only thing standing between a patient and a decision made for reasons that have nothing to do with medicine. One of the nurses, a young woman named Petra, maybe 24, who had the particular quality of someone who asked questions from genuine need rather than performance, raised her hand near the end. "What do you do?" Petra said. "When you file the note and someone tries to remove it, like someone who has more authority?" Nora looked at her, looked at the room. 11 faces, all of them absorbing something in the specific way of people who are new enough to understand that what they're hearing will matter later, even if they don't know which moment it will matter in. "You file it again," she said. "You document the removal. You document every interaction related to the removal. And you remember that documentation doesn't care who's trying to make it go away. It just exists, and it keeps existing. And eventually the people trying to make it disappear have to come to terms with the fact that what you recorded is what happened, and what happened is what it was." Petra wrote something down. Nora looked at the room one more time. These people would work in environments that were difficult and underpaid and frequently thankless, where the margin between a patient who made it and a patient who didn't sometimes came down to a single observation made by a single person at 4 a.m. who decided it was worth one more push. They would be told they were wrong by people with more titles. They would be second-guessed and overridden, and occasionally made to feel like their judgment was a problem rather than the thing keeping someone alive. Some of them would fold. She had no illusions about that. Some of them would find the accumulated weight of being right in ways nobody wanted to acknowledge too heavy, and they would learn to let things go. And maybe that was its own survival, and she didn't think she had the standing to judge it. But some of them wouldn't. Some of them would be the person who files the note at 4:53 a.m. Some of them would be the person who goes back to look at the x-ray. Some of them would be the person who stands in a doorway and says the thing that needs to be said in the specific quiet that comes before everything gets louder. Those people didn't need to be told they were brave. They usually weren't thinking about brave. They were thinking about the patient, about the number on the monitor, about the sound in a man's chest that didn't match what his chart said. They just needed to know that being right was worth something, even when the room was telling them otherwise, especially then. "Any other questions?" she said. The room was quiet for a moment. Then Petra raised her hand again. "Can we go through the tension pneumo assessment one more time?" Nora almost smiled. "Yeah," she said. "We can." She turned back to the whiteboard, picked up the dry erase marker, and started from the beginning.